This is Climate Watch. I'm Zhao Ying. Welcome to the show. Deadly wildfires have swept across large swaths of Europe in recent weeks, forcing hundreds of thousands of people to flee their homes and leaving vast areas of land scorched. The two largest blazes in France and Spain have become the biggest ever recorded in those countries since European Union data collection began. At their peak, those fires alone displaced over 300,000 people, stretching firefighters, aircraft, and emergency services to their limits. According to the EU's Copernicus Climate Change Service, Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, heating at more than twice the global average since the 1980s. Rising temperatures and prolonged drought create ideal conditions for wildfires, allowing them to ignite more easily and spread more rapidly. What's behind Europe's increasingly destructive wildfire seasons? Are these fires becoming the new normal in a warming climate? Joining us now is Víctor Resco de Dios, professor of forest science and global change at the University of Lleida in Spain. Victor, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So we've seen hundreds of thousands of people evacuated across France and Spain. How would you describe the scale and significance of this year's wildfire season?
I could describe it as unprecedented, but at the same time as a warning of what's coming. Unprecedented in the short term, in the sense that it is the first time that a major capital city in Europe, such as Madrid, has been threatened by a wildfire. But at the same time, it is nothing relative to what's coming under unabated climate change and with all the growing in all the fuel, all the vegetation that's fueling these fires.
And we know that Europe actually experienced record-breaking heat back in June, and that was followed by prolonged drought across much of France and Spain. How did these conditions kind of create the perfect environment for these massive wildfires?
Well, we come from a very wet winter, so at the start of spring, we had our vegetation as wet and green as it could be, but then we had all these series of heat waves you were referring to, which are very good, very efficient, very fast at dehydrating vegetation, especially the grasses and all the small stature shrubs. So what this does is that essentially it's priming the vegetation for the fuel. So overall, fires in Europe and in Spain, they're usually not limited by fuel. Usually we have, and by fuel I mean the biomass that helps or that makes possible that the fire spreads. So essentially what's growing on the surface of the soil, grasses, shrubs, litter, and so on. So we have enough of those to carry fires. What's limiting fire activity is that they need to be dry enough to allow fire to spread. So what these heat waves are doing is priming the vegetation, is creating the conditions that make this fuel available to the wildfire. So that's what's setting the scene. And then another weather factor that's important is the atmospheric instability, which is something that then helps develop this sort of firestorms in a way, meaning that the wildfire can climb up to the higher altitudes in the atmosphere, and that sort of amplifies fire behavior.
Well, scientists often say that no single wildfire can be attributed directly to climate change, but they also say that climate change is making these events more likely and more severe. So can you explain how climate change is influencing the conditions behind these fires?
Wildfires are a natural phenomenon on Earth. They've been around for over 400 million years. And, humans have only been around for 2.5 million years. Mm-hmm. So, we've had wildfires for a while, and wildfires have actually been very important for the evolution of our species. I mean, things that we were able to, when we learned to cook, then our brains evolved, and it helped us evolve as a species. And it is also a factor that's driving biodiversity in many ways. But it is true that over the last few decades, we have been seeing an intensification of fire activity. We've been seeing how wildfire intensity has been increasing. Fire seasons have become at least 30% more intense over the last couple of decades. And this results from the interaction between two factors. One of them is rural abandonment and the growth of the trees in some areas like near Barcelona. We are at peak levels of biomass. We haven't had more vegetation, more forest cover now than in the last 100,000 years. So forest surface is increasing, and that has lots of good outcomes, but it also entails some risks, such as increased fuel for the fires. And then on top of the increase of fuels, on top of the increase in biomass, we now have an atmosphere that's thirstier than it was. It's hotter. It evaporates water more quickly. It makes vegetation stay dry enough for a longer part of the year, and it creates these conditions of atmospheric instability, which helps amplify this fire behavior. So climate change has been interacting with changes in land use to create these conditions for the perfect storm. But the specific effects of climate change are what I was saying before, of longer fire season, drying the fuels, and these changes in atmospheric instability.
Yeah, and we learned that Europe is the world's fastest warming continent. It is heating at more than twice the speed of global average. Why is Europe warming so much faster than the rest of the planet?
Well, usually the farther you move away from the equator, the faster the rate of climate change. And yes, I mean, the Mediterranean is one of these hotspots for climate change. We're seeing an increase in climate change. And from the perspective of fire behavior, what's particularly worrying in a way is what's happening with climate change during the nights, because nighttime temperatures are increasing faster than daytime temperatures. And, back in the day, the nights used to provide an opportunity for firefighting, or fire suppression, because overnight temperatures are lower, relative humidities are higher, so it was a chance for firefighters to do their job. However, under climate change, what we are seeing is that the nights are warming faster than the days. And what this means is that we are increasing the number of hours available to fire. We are losing a window of opportunity for fire suppression teams. So this is another of the impacts, of the climatic impacts, and the drive from this faster, from climate change, and from the fact that Europe is warming faster than other continents.
Yeah, so do you think these kinds of large-scale wildfires is becoming part of a new normal?
I don't think it makes sense to speak of a new normal anymore. I mean, I think we're in a transitory state. This is not like COVID. When we had COVID, we went from before COVID, and then we went back to normal after COVID ended. But this is something entirely different. This is a transient process. Fuel loads are increasing, and climate change is intensifying. And there are no signs of stabilization. There are no signs that we can come back to the previous situation like happened with COVID. So I don't think we should be talking of a new normal. We should be talking of a permanent transient state. Within this permanent transient state now, where conditions are going to be getting worse and worse. And where are we heading? Well, we are now heading into situations where we can have either a single fire or a complex of fires joining, merging, and leading to fire complexes over 100,000 hectares. The biggest fire in Spain used to be about 30,000 hectares. Last year, we had a record in fire size in a fire that was over 40,000 hectares. This year, we've had a new record with the fire complex around Madrid nearly reaching 80,000 hectares. So now we're approaching conditions similar to those in California, in Australia, and we cannot rule out 1 million hectare fires as climate change is intensifying and it's drying like the big mountain ranges such as the Pyrenees, the Iberian system, the mountains near the Cantabrian Sea. I mean, we have lots of continuity of fuel in those areas, and there is more and more because of rural abandonment, and now it's drier and drier because of climate change. So, in a few years, decades maybe, we are going to enter into situations like those we have in Australia, in California. We could have fires that are 1 million hectares at this point, unless we do something. And, when talking about wildfires, we're always talking about these doom horror stories, right? But I think it's important to understand that what I'm saying right now is what a medical doctor would say to a patient that has an infection, and that patient has decided not to take any medication. And in that case, well, the doctor will say, if you don't take any medication, you have an infection, so that's likely going to bring you some problems and you might die. but you can take antibiotics and you're likely going to be fine. So what I'm saying right now is what happens with a patient that actively decides not to do anything against it. We cannot change CO2 levels in the atmosphere. We cannot change temperatures. We do not have a thermostat, but we can change the fuel. So to some extent, or to a large extent, we can adapt to climate change and mitigate these problems. So although we have these horror stories that we're going towards the million hectare fire, we don't have to go that route. I mean, the future is not written. The future is in our hands, and it's going to depend on our actions.
Actually, wildfires were once concentrated mainly in southern Europe, right? But we're now seeing increasing fire risk in part of central and even northern Europe as well. So what is driving this geographic expansion?
Right, we're seeing two changes geographically. There's the increase in latitude you were referring to, and also an increase in latitude. Last year, we had the largest proportion ever of wildfires, over 1,000 meters in southwestern Europe. And what's driving this is the same thing as what's driving the current fire seasons in the rest of the continent. The interaction between climate change and fuel loads. All over Europe, forest surface is increasing. All over Europe, biomass is increasing. And that biomass is getting drier due to climate change. So we had last year, for instance, we had the largest fire in Scotland, 12,000 hectares. This year, we've had over 100 houses burned near Oslo in Norway due to wildfire, houses that were in the middle of the forest. So I think the situation is changing. And I think this is a big concern for areas like the Alps, for areas with big continuity of forest, like the Black Forest in Germany. I think that's about 600,000 hectares. Here we have these large continuities of forests that are going to become increasingly concerned and increasingly threatened by wildfire. So Central Europe is in a way in the situation that we were 20 years ago in Mediterranean Europe, in the sense that the time to prepare for wildfires is now. They don't have the big wildfire conditions that we have, but they will in a few years from now. So it is now time to start managing that land to prepare in advance for what's coming.
Yeah, and actually Europe is also experiencing record low river levels, water restrictions, and extreme heat this summer. So, I mean, these are not separate crises, right? Are they just different expressions of the same climate system under stress?
Yeah, I think that they're expressions of the same, and in many areas, part of the reason why we have less water available to humans is not necessarily because it's raining less. Certainly within the Mediterranean basin, we do not have less precipitation than we had 100 years ago. Part of it is also driven by land use change and by this rural abandonment. What some studies tell us, or what most studies tell us, is that the reason why, at least in Mediterranean Europe, we have less water available for humans is because forest surface has been increasing. And as a result of that, you have more trees using water. You have more vegetation using water. So the evaporation of water has increased. And of course, the evaporation of water has also increased because temperatures are getting higher. But in terms of what is the main driver behind this water shortage, it is not, precipitation is not the main driver. It hasn't increased. It is the evaporation because we have more trees, because we have more forest surface. That's the primary factor. And then climate change is the secondary factor because it is also making the atmosphere thirsty. So this is the hierarchy that the studies indicate. So it is part of, we can speak instead of climate change, I like to speak of global change because it's a change in many different parameters that urbanization has led. Urbanization is creating lots of problems in terms of civil protection and citizen safety for people living near forests. Those 100 houses I just mentioned that were burned near Norway, those were houses completely surrounded by forests. So the patterns of urban sprawl and urbanization and rural abandonment and growing trees are driving this. And it also has global consequences because if we abandon the management in Europe, this means that we're going to need to get resources from other parts of the world because, we still eat 3 times a day and so on. So what's happening is that now we're increasing pressure on the Amazon basin, on the Congo basin, and what's in a way abandoning the farming activity in Europe is fueling a global crisis because it is increasing locally fire activity, amplified by global climate change, of course, but we have more fuel as a result of land abandonment. And then in the tropics, what's happening is that people are burning those forests or burning the cerrado, the savannas in Brazil, to grow crops, to import food for Europe. So we're really fueling a global crisis with our current way of obtaining resources and managing the land.
Yes, so you mentioned rural abandonment and the change of the land use, and also we are saying these, housing development at the wildland urban interface. I mean, can you explain more on these factors, like how they are contributing to these mega fires apart from, natural elements like heat and drought?
Right. Well, in urban interface, it's not necessarily increasing fire activity. What it's increasing is the risk for population. So here there are two factors interacting. One of them is that many towns, many cities, and I'm including big cities like Barcelona or Madrid, in the periphery, they used to have crops. So when you have crops in your periphery, like olive orchards or vineyards or pistachios or sunflowers, essentially crops that remain green during the summer, here you have a natural fire break. So you have a fire, it's going to stop before it hits the city, before it hits the urban area. Why? Because there's no fuel in these crops. Now, because these crops are being abandoned, these cities are being more and more threatened by wildfire. This happens in big cities, but it also happens in small cities. This happens all over the coast, from the northern coast near France in Catalonia to the southern coast in Andalusia. It also happens in many other regions in northwestern Spain, etc., etc. So it is a common situation that many towns, a large population is now more exposed than ever to wildfire because farms are being abandoned. But then there is the other issue, and it is when people build inside the forest. When people build inside the forest and do not consider wildfire risk as a factor, then you're just exposing yourself to the flames, to the blazes. So it is important to acquire this risk culture, to incorporate into urban plans. How are we going to deal with the increasing fire threat? Because here we're not talking of hectares, we're not talking of pine trees or oaks being burned. Here we're talking of houses being burned. Here we're talking of potential fatalities. This year we lost 13 people to fires in a wildfire in Andalusia, in southern Spain. So we really need to understand that this is not a joke. This is a serious threat, and wildfire must take priority when planning for urban development.
Yes, and we know that wildfires release enormous amount of carbon dioxide, while forests that once absorbed carbon are being destroyed. So could we be entering a dangerous feedback loop where climate change fuels more fires and fires in turn accelerate climate change?
Yeah, that's right. That's particularly a concern. I mean, it is a concern here, but that's particularly a concern in boreal areas, especially areas covered by permafrost, which is this permanent ice. So if you have the soil that's always frozen, then you have no biological activity. But as long as those soils are being unfrozen, then bacteria start to respire and releasing CO2. And then because you have vegetation growing and that's becoming seasonally dry, then you can have fires. This is something that could have a positive feedback effect, as you were saying, on climate change. And by positive feedback, I don't mean something good. The use of positive feedback means that it's amplifying the process. It doesn't mean whether it's good or bad. But we have more areas that before could not burn, that store a huge amount of carbon in their soil. Those are increasingly being affected by fire. And this is something that could amplify a wildfire. Overall, land use changes are considered responsible for about 10% of global emissions relative to fossil fuel emissions. Land use change is supposed to account for 10%, but there is a lot of variation from one year to another year. And for instance, in 2023, the fires in Canada, they emitted more carbon than any other country in the world, except for the three biggest emitting countries, China, India, and the States. They still emitted more fire, but Canadian wildfires emitted more CO2 than any other country in the world, except for those three.
Can these forests recover from repeated fires, or is there a point where ecosystems just fundamentally change?
Well, fire is a response of ecosystems to natural processes in the sense that biomass does not accumulate forever in a forest. Biomass accumulates until somebody eats it, like a herbivore, and I'm talking of before humans, the pre-anthropic area. Biomass accumulates until somebody eats it, like a herbivore, or consumes it, like a fire. So what we are seeing now is the natural result of having a lot of vegetation, a lot of biomass that has been accumulating over 5, 6 7 decades, which is the time that has passed since the peak of rural exodus, rural abandonment. And this is nature's way of managing this excess biomass. So this is, in that sense, it's part of the natural response of an ecosystem to having more biomass, and it is part of the response to climate warming, to climate change, where you have more the conditions that are becoming drier and hotter and therefore easier to burn. It is this natural process. This doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an ecological catastrophe. I mean, in many areas of the world, certainly in Mediterranean countries, we have a lot less fire activity than we should. And this may sound paradoxical, but this is actually part of the problem. And naturally, in Spanish forests, before humans, we know that 15% of the vegetation burned annually. And what this means is that when you had a fire, it was a low-intensity fire most of the time, meaning that it was burning in the understory and that was no big deal. But now we are burning less than 1% annually. And what this means is that there is more and more fuel in the forest. And when there is a fire, that fire is becoming very intense. This is part of the change that we are seeing now. It is a result of this accumulation of biomass for so long. And it is the result of how nature is responding and adapting to climate change.
Okay, but we are seeing the rise in both the frequency and severity of these wildfires. So, can nature adapt fast enough to this, new normal, new situation?
I think the main problem with fires is social and economic. You mentioned CO2 emissions, but there's also pollution problems. There is this particulate matter, some very, very thin particles of soot and tars that get into when we are breathing it, we breathe these small particles. They're thought to be responsible globally for the premature death of over 300,000 people. So wildfires that are a public health issue. In Europe, we have quantified how more people die during wildfires than during terrorist attacks. So it is a civil protection issue. And I think that this is the main, and I could put many more examples in the tourist sector, et cetera, et cetera. From the point of view of ecology, wildfires may become a problem if the severity is very high, because then we have lots of areas and that's going to be very difficult to establish. Fortunately, within a fire, we usually have these green islands, these green patches of trees that are going to be very important to regenerate the stands. And many species, like wolf, for example, wolf loves areas that have burned at high intensity. Why? Well, because they can see their prey easier. They can see their prey faster. We have some eagles that they come to wildfire just a few days after the flames are off, essentially because it's easier for them to hunt. There are, of course, some species that are vulnerable to wildfire, and wildfire may become a problem when we have large areas burned at high severity, but we should not always consider that fire is going to be an ecological catastrophe. The negative impacts, more importantly, are going to be social and economic. We do need to have some quick restorative action in areas that could lose important amounts of soil, because soil is a resource that takes a lot of time to renew, hundreds or even thousands of years. And that would also have impacts for citizen safety, because it could increase flash floods for people living downstream, because it could decrease water quality. It could lead to water availability issues, because you have a lot of turbidity in the water after the fire. So those are the times when we would need to act quickly to restore fire activity. If there are some vulnerable species to fire, capercaillie, for example, it's a species of bird that's endangered and very vulnerable to fire, then, well, maybe in that case we need to evaluate whether some restorative actions would need to be done. But overall, fire should not be equated with an ecological catastrophe. It is a natural process that has been on Earth for over 400 million years, and after 400 million years, we still have lots of plants and animals and so on.
But how do we keep the right balance there? And are there specific tree species that are perhaps more fire resistant than others?
Usually in Mediterranean ecosystems, we think of developing this mosaic structure of the territory, of the landscape, where you would have an alternation of different types of vegetation. So you could have old-growth forest, young forest, shrublands, along with pastures, along with crops such as olive trees and vineyards and so on. And so you would have this variety of uses, this variety of fuels, this variety of fuel loads, which is something that would allow firefighters to do their job. The problem now is that we have so much biomass in our forest that when there is a fire, the fire burns with such an intensity that in many cases, firefighters can do nothing about it because it's just too hot. So developing some management strategies where we manage about 5% of the land, 3 times the area burned. This is a way that we can minimize the chances of having these mega fires. In terms of species that can resist better to the wildfire, it's interesting looking at the history of evolution, of plant evolution in Earth, because the point when conifers are the family of trees to which pines belong, the time when conifers first appeared on land, it was a period with very high fire activity. We know that because oxygen concentrations were very high and there was a lot of charcoal in the sediment record and so on. And if we looked at the point when angiosperms evolved, angiosperms are the plants with flower, they also evolved. There's also a large speciation, the appearance of lots of species at a time when wildfire activity was very high. So wildfire is thought to have driven the diversity of many plant species, and this means that many plant species are adapted to wildfire. Many oaks can resprout. Some pine trees, not all of them, but some have their seeds stored in cones, and those cones will slowly open after the fire. This is called seroteny. So those species will recover this way. Some pine species, some other pine species, they do not have this seed bank in their canopies. Usually the plants that resprout, they recover quickly, and plants that regenerate from seed after the fire, such as the pines or some shrubs, well, that will take a bit longer. But when we see a black forest, a forest that has been burned, we should not think of that as a graveyard. We should think of that as a kindergarten, as the place where once the first rains come, there will be the green sprouts will come again.
Well, Europe actually has some of the world's most ambitious climate policies, but does this year's wildfire season kind of change the conversation about the urgency of adaptation alongside emissions reduction?
Well, I hope so. I hope so, because when the European Commission wrote their biodiversity strategy a few years ago, or the forest strategy also a few years ago, fires were barely mentioned. Brussels has been completely oblivious to the fire issue. Only last year, when we had over 1 million hectares burned in Europe, the European Commission started to react. And earlier this year, they published a communication on wildfires, which doesn't include any specific actions, doesn't include any specific budget, but it is a signal that the European Commission is finally, 1 million hectares later, it is starting to consider wildfire. I think the European Commission has so far considered fires as a Mediterranean issue, not as a European issue, and this should change. This should change because they're gonna be suffering it otherwise. In these central and northern European issues if they don't take fires seriously. So I do hope that this serves as a green light, as an eye opener. The European Union has responded to fires in terms of the civil protection, so more planes and more resources for putting out fires, but not from the point of view of attacking the structural causes of the fire problem, which is biomass and how much fuel there is in our lands.
Okay, Victor, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And that wraps up this edition of Climate Watch. You can find more episodes on your favorite podcast platforms. Just search for Climate Watch and hit subscribe. Don't forget to leave us a quick review or share it with a friend. You can also email us at radio@cjtn.com with your questions or feedback. And stay updated on the latest climate stories with our Substack newsletter, Climate Choices. I'm Zhao Ying. Thank you so much for listening. See you next time.